This is Madam Speaker, and on the programme we asked, to South Africans, what do human rights mean? And I think my first question to my jury, I'll throw to Seke. It would seem that states aren't doing as well as they can. I mean, I heard a stat from the SA Human Rights Commission earlier today about 14,000, well, they would say typically service delivery-led protests in South Africa last year. So people are out on the streets and people are protesting. People don't seem to be accepting the arguments from the state, and they're hopeful for change. What are you hearing from the constituency that you represent?
Well, I think my argument would be that governments are increasingly paying lip service to change. When we look at the third generation, second generation of human rights, which are economic and social and cultural rights, which are rights around the environment and developmental rights, most governments, including the government of South Africa, have not invested in how those rights can bring dignity to the people within their countries.
But you know, Mr. Jeffries is saying, you know, we've created all of these interactive structures. You know, we've devolved central governments, that people have their local authorities and the municipalities and their councillors, and there are, you know, public hearings and so on, that there is a platform created for engagement. Where do you see the disconnect there?
And I would like to push back that those platforms are not providing the type of engagement we would like to see. I'd also like to push back that in terms of how the people are being heard, in terms of corruption that is manifesting itself at all levels of government, in terms of how resources are not being put back into education, into health, in terms of how people are not being employed and getting their full wages. The dignity that we speak to when we're talking about human rights is not there. And it's not just here in South Africa, it's across the globe.
Well, let's turn the question then to the South African Human Rights Commission, Alex, and typically, what are the complaints that you're hearing and you're getting?
So
and people do people even know that you're an agency for the amplification and the pursuit of their rights?
So we have taken a number of steps to boost the reach of the Commission, and a number of steps to boost advocacy and communication so that people are aware of what the Commission does and that they can bring complaints and what the nature of complaints that we accept is. So we are seeing an increase in our complaints data, so we are receiving more complaints year on year, which does indicate to us that we are boosting our image and people are more aware of our existence. In terms of the types of complaints that we receive, overwhelmingly the biggest group of complaints we receive are equality complaints. They fall into the category equality. That's about 14% of our total complaints. And then within the category of equality, it's race complaints, complaints to do with racial discrimination. That are the vast majority, about 2/3 of our equality complaints, and they deal with usually use of racial epithets.
And Pindula, I'd like your diagnosis from a youth activist perspective. And I mean, you know, we know very well the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. It's not the only movement that young people in our university or in education spaces have engaged in to raise the profile of rights abuses. What's your perspective from the, you know, the tertiary institution level, or from a young people perspective?
Part of the problem in the country is the idea of human rights in and of itself has pacified the youth. And how has it pacified the youth? The idea that you can go to protest and protest for what you want to achieve at the end of the day is part of the problem, and we need to start problematizing the problem in and of itself. In what sense do I mention this? I mention this because, one, the reason why the youth today is stuck in a negation of some sort, it's because the structures that are in place fragment the idea of protest in and of itself. If you look at the 2016 Fees Must Fall, it was one of the most violent protests we've had in the country. Not the most violent, but one of the most violent, Marikana being the leading one. So in the 2016 Fees Must Fall, today we say there's a right to protest, but there's students who are still languishing in jail for the idea of protesting for free education, a free education that we all enshrine in our constitution to say there must be access.
The state will say it has the right to protect property. The state will say it has the right to preserve the independence of institutions.
I fully agree with you. The state has the right to protect property. It has the right to protect the independence of the institutions. But if you look at cases like UCT, WITS, and you look at your vendors and other universities, Limpopo, for example, there wasn't any banning of state property. There's a comrade of ours currently who's spending 4 years, I think, now in prison, Kaya Tregeshe. There isn't really property that can be attributed to the crimes he's serving time for in prison. So the idea of human rights in and of itself needs to be problematized first, to say, and I'll cite a very famous judgment of Fronaman J. In Shoprite Checkers. The idea of dignity needs to be attached to the idea of rights. You can't understand rights without the idea of dignity. So,
all right, hold that thought for me, Mpendulo. John Jeffries, let me turn it back and the question back to you. In terms of the work that the Justice Ministry does, I mean, what is the track record on prosecutions around human rights?
Well, obviously, any crime is a violation of a human right. So, there's lots of those. I'm not sure. I'm not possibly understanding the question. There would be, for example, equality courts to deal with complaints against the violation of the right to equality, and those are civil courts. A complaint between two people, a matter will often come there from the Human Rights Commission. And the court will make a ruling that
actually
the right
you're right.
violated.
I mean, you're right. I mean, the sensible response is that every time an arrest is made in court, it's because somebody's rights have been trampled upon. Maybe just then talk to us about the separation or the institution of specialized courts to deal with certain things in our society. So typically, race matters or hate speech matters would be dealt with in a separate court.
No. You've got criminal courts, civil courts. I think the special court is an equality court, which can be at a magistrates court level, regional court, high court level. So that's your specialist court, as it were. Hate crimes would be normal crimes. We have got legislation in Parliament to define them or provide for hate speech as well, but those would also go through the criminal courts.
I mean, so what I'm hearing quite keenly is, and what we heard from the jury and from Ricky as well, is yes, we have this wonderful architecture that promotes access to justice, but the experience at street level seems to be far away from the aspirations of those laws. I'd like your sense on how well we're doing in making sure that people trust the process from the point at which they open up a case at the charge office to the point at which a docket is preserved, and now thankfully there's e-docketing, so there's a digital system attached to that. But often I hear the breakdown in the entire chain of command, which is the pursuit for justice, which has a direct impact on whether citizens can enjoy their rights or not.
No, I think we can always improve. I think we've still got some way to go, particularly with criminal
Where's
matters.
the biggest problem from your perspective now?
I think it would be the complainants getting feedback for how the case is going. It can take some time between laying the charge and the matter, the accused being arrested and the trial finally being heard. So very often then people are not informed as to what is going on. So I think that would be one of the problems. But what is important, I think the main messages I'd want to give is people need to know their rights. Because you can't enforce your rights if you don't. And then people must know where to go to enforce their rights.
And on that point, is there that information sharing to the point, I mean, people make assumptions about communities. People make assumptions about, people who protest, whether they have forgotten the consultative process, whether they're trying to leapfrog, their headline struggles and not following what has been set in place. Do you get the sense that people are well aware of their rights and that they know how to pursue those rights? But it's the dysfunctionality of the system that is letting them down, which leads to protests in the way that we see.
I think it's a combination of both. I think that a lot of work still has to be done for people to understand the rights infrastructure that we have developed in South Africa. So when people talk about dignity as the underlying value of our rights infrastructure, I don't think that I don't think that's well understood and embraced in society.
Why is it not well understood?
Well, we haven't.
Is it because information is not there, or because it's too complicated to understand?
No, it's not complicated to understand. I don't think that we as a society have done what I would call preventative work. Right? So we talk about an infrastructure which is about protection once a crime has happened. We haven't talked about the work that prevents a crime from happening in the first place. What is the work that we have to do to transform as a society? Up until 1994, we were a society that was unequal, where dignity was not respected. We were a society where we didn't respect rights. So we didn't suddenly become a different society in 1994. We needed to go through a process of healing, a process of understanding, a process of shifting our behavior.
You know what's interesting for me, and maybe it's to digress just a little bit, but it's even on the notion of how we name this day. In a separate platform, I'm advocating, and John, I know you want to come in on this one, advocating for us to own the day for what it is. It's Sharpeville Day. And the reason that's important is because we give people options in our society for how they want to remember it, which allows them as well to be comfortable where people should be uncomfortable about what the triggers were for a day like that, and how historically those triggers still remain amongst us in terms of inequality and the invisibilizing of entire communities. I'd like your thoughts on whether we've done enough work in honestly accepting and recognizing our past, and not done the airbrushing work, which in some ways might be why we sit with the situation of assumption that we have the laws, but the practice or the experience of human rights doesn't exist in our country. Anyone can go first. Pendula, maybe you.
I think it's quite embarrassing that 25 years into, in fact, almost 40 plus years ago, students were striking for the same thing in South Africa in 1976, and today students are still striking for the same thing, which is free, the right to education, which I think would be an investment, a great investment for a country like South Africa. So in terms of the idea of human rights in and of itself, I don't think we are supposed to even be terming the day today a Human Rights Day, because it is an insult not only to the past but to the future even, and to the present, as I do say. So the long short of what I'm trying to drive at is to say, going forward as a country, we first need to problematize the idea of rights in and of itself. We need to sharpen the contradictions, to say, have we looked into the past to say, okay, fine, what is it that people were fighting for pre-1994? Is it still the same thing? And if it's still the same thing, then it means there's something we're doing wrong. There's structures and legislation in place, but is it doing what it's supposed to do? No, it's not.
All right. I'm going to ask you to take a breath for me just there, because as we always say with this program, the time is evaporating like water on the dunes. We'll get some closing comments from our guests. Don't move. This is Madam Speaker.